when Jeff asked me to speak here, I said, so you want my usual speech on the U.S. Congress? And he said, no. I'm thinking, what do I talk about? So he sent me a question, how the United States has considered strategic deterrence over the years, to which I replied, oh, I can do that in about an hour. And he said, you have 15 minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about a very narrow, admittedly very narrow slice of U.S. nuclear doctrine. Yes, nuclear doctrine, and yes, doctrine on nuclear deterrence. Very narrow, and you're all going to be bored to tears, but I think, or at least I hope, that what I'm going to talk about will give you some sense of how to apply it to a broader picture. And I'm going to talk about declaratory policy with the concept that words matter. And I have to thank General Hetherington for saying that this morning, because I had looked through the description of what this panel was supposed to cover, trying to find a hook for how I describe this. Words matter. And that's what I'm going to talk about. I recognize that I'm going to get into some weeds, but I'm going to do a lot of quoting because the words are very specific. And when you're talking about nuclear weapons and nuclear use, the words matter. And specifically official words in either nuclear posture reviews or administration statements or U.S. statements at the UN. So I'll quote those directly, and hopefully there'll be some train of thought here that will fit into the rest of the conference's focus on forces and operations and planning. I'm going to talk about the words. So I want to start with something Jeffrey said, but I'm going to do it by quoting someone else, defining strategic deterrence. Last December at the Reagan National Defense Forum, General John Hyten, who's the commander of STRATCOM, said, the fundamentals of deterrence have not changed. There are three fundamentals that he identified. Have the ability to impose a cost on an adversary. I've heard that several times this morning. Have the ability to deny a benefit to the adversary. Credibly communicate that capability to the adversary. Those are his three fundamentals. I'd like to add a fourth. Credibly communicate the threat to the adversary. Not just our capability, but our willingness to use that capability and the circumstances under which we would use that capability. Secretary of Defense Mattis and then Secretary of State Tillerson wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal last August. And it was in response to a rather unhinged, I can't use that word in public, it's judgmental, statement by the president that you might remember having the phrase fire and fury in it. What Secretary of Defense Mattis and Secretary of State Tillerson said in their op-ed is, and we will say again here, any attack will be defeated, any use of nuclear weapons will be met with an effective and overwhelming response. In other words, when and how we will respond if you do X, Y, Z. That is a credible deterrent threat, or hopefully credible deterrent threat. So moving on from those statements of what deterrence is, there are three components of a credible strategic deterrence posture. The first is the strategy and doctrine, the outward-facing description of why, how, and when we would use nuclear weapons. The things we tell ourselves and the rest of the world, what would be acceptable and unacceptable, how we would approach it, whether it's minimum deterrence or assured destruction, or if you're in the 1950s, massive retaliation, the outward-facing component. Inwardly, the second component is the employment guidance. It describes to ourselves the plans, the programs, the options, the cases, how we would use nuclear weapons if and when the case arose. Now, one would hope that the employment guidance is consistent with the outward-facing strategy and doctrine, but it doesn't have to be so, and there are probably many examples of when it hasn't been so. Finally, there's the force structure. When combined with the employment guidance, lets the adversary know you have the capability and the means to carry out the threats you've enunciated in your strategy and doctrine. That's strategic deterrence. Now, some would argue that demonstrated capabilities are far more important than communications about potential use, as the adversary can see them, make his own decision, and, as Jeff said, either be deterred from taking actions we don't want him to take or not. But in the nuclear world, threats are not necessarily self-evident, even when the forces are visible, particularly if the adversary thinks that nuclear use would be excessive in a particular circumstance. Your threat to use nuclear weapons isn't credible if the bad guy doesn't think you'd actually use them in that circumstance. So the communications are important. You have to be clear with the adversary about both when you would or could use them, because we do in the United States at least leave some ambiguity, let the bad guy use his own imagination, when we could or would use nuclear weapons, but you also, or we also in the United States, clearly delineate when we would not use nuclear weapons. Because if everything is subject to a nuclear threat, then nothing's subject to a nuclear threat. You're just undercutting your credibility by throwing it out all the time. So this is what I'm going to focus on today, the declaratory policy, the words we say outwardly facing to other countries about when we would or would not use nuclear weapons. Now, the first half of declaratory policy are those statements about when we would use nuclear weapons or could use nuclear weapons. And specifically, the United States does not have and has never had a no first use policy. We have never said we would not be the first to use nuclear weapons. During the Cold War, this was obviously a part of our effort to extend deterrence to Europe and Asia, with the acknowledgement that we could respond to a major conventional attack with nuclear weapons. Implicitly, a major conventional attack from a nuclear-armed state or a nuclear-armed alliance. It was the Soviet Union and, to a lesser extent, China. The rest of the world was not subject to nuclear threats from the United States. We didn't say we wouldn't use them, at least not until 1978, but we didn't have to say we would because we weren't in a nuclear deterrent relationship with them. But the possible first use of nuclear weapons has remained a part of U.S. planning doctrine over the past 25 years after the end of the Cold War. Although there has been a sense at some times that first use would be reserved, as I said, for those nations with nuclear weapons, but in circumstances where nuclear weapons had not yet been used. So a nuclear weapons armed state engaged in other activities that could escalate to nuclear use, we might use nuclear weapons first. We have not forsworn that. The 2010 Nuclear Posture Review specifically stated, 2010, the Obama Nuclear Posture Review, specifically stated that in the case of states that possess nuclear weapons and states not in compliance with their nuclear nonproliferation obligation, there remains, and I quote, a narrow range of contingencies in which U.S. nuclear weapons may still play a role in deterring a conventional or chemical biological weapons attack against the United States or its allies and partners. So no first use policy. The 2018 NPR made the same statement, that we would use nuclear weapons only in extreme circumstances. But they made those extreme circumstances somewhat more explicit than the Obama administration had, less ambiguous. And I asked Elaine to look this up for me so I could write them down. The extreme circumstances that could include a non-nuclear strategic attack, which could include an attack on civilian population, civilian infrastructure, nuclear command and control, warning and attack. The word cyber does not appear in this paragraph, but it does appear in other places. It seemed in 2010 that those circumstances where nuclear weapons states might be subject to the first use of nuclear weapons by the United States was expanding. Those who wrote these paragraphs said, no, we're just being more explicit, though we had never ruled it out. So the words matter. People reading the NPRs assumed there were a narrow set of circumstances in 2010 and a broader set of circumstances in 2018. Those writing the words said, no, we're just being more explicit. If U.S. analysts disagree about what the words mean, I'm pretty certain the bad guys who are trying to deter are a little confused as well. Just pointing out, words matter. The second set here are what we refer to, or the United States has always referred to the international community as negative security assurances. Those promises that we won't use nuclear weapons that we make to a certain category of nations. And since 1978, we have made those promises to nations in good standing with their nonproliferation obligations, promising that they will not face the threat of nuclear weapons attack. But there's always been some exceptions to that promise. First, the Warsaw Pact nations. They didn't have nuclear weapons, but they'd be in alliance with a nuclear state. In the late 1990s, we made exceptions for chemical weapons, and what I refer to as the Pelindaba exception. It was applied to the nuclear weapons-free zone negotiations in Africa. We've made exceptions for bioweapons, and in 2018 for non-nuclear strategic attack. But what's more important than the exceptions is the question of whether this promise not to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states is a promise or a threat. When it's used as a promise, it's designed to discourage nuclear proliferation. We say, you don't need nuclear weapons to deter us. We won't use nuclear weapons against us there. We promise you we won't do it, therefore you don't need nuclear weapons. When it's used as a threat, it's designed to deter a range of behaviors, even if by threatening it, it might encourage nuclear proliferation. What do I mean? If we say to a nation who doesn't have nuclear weapons, if you do X, Y, Z, we might use nuclear weapons against you, they might think, well, then I need my own nuclear weapons to deter you. So the question of whether our promise not to use nuclear weapons is more of an assurance or a threat, a promise or a threat, is important. And we've switched back and forth with that over the years. Let me give you some examples. In 1978, we first issued this negative security assurance during the UN Special Session on Disarmament, where non-nuclear weapon states sought assurances that the nuclear weapon states wouldn't use nuclear weapons against them. And Secretary of State Cyrus Vance submitted the statement at the time, and every president through President Clinton reaffirmed it. The Bush administration, the second Bush administration, kind of reaffirmed it. There was this episode where then Undersecretary of State John Bolton gave an interview in Arms Control Today where he said, oh, that assurance, and I'll tell you the words of the assurance in a minute, that assurance doesn't apply anymore. And everyone went, whoa, because that's the promise we give to states that why they don't need their own nuclear weapons. And the next day, the State Department spokesman came out and walked back the Bolton statement. And I raise that with a little bit of belaboring right now because understanding John Bolton's mindset is something we're all trying to do a bit these days. But the negative security assurance in 1978, which persisted till 1998 at least, was the United States would not use or threaten to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states who were parties to the NPT or a similarly binding agreement unless that nation was supporting a nuclear weapon state in an attack on the United States or its allies, the Warsaw Pact exclusion. This meant the United States would not alter its nuclear planning to accommodate the Warsaw Pact states that weren't nuclear armed. They were lumped in with the Soviet Union. But everyone else who was a member in good standing with the NPT was not subject to nuclear threats by the United States. That was a very broad statement. The Clinton and Bush administrations began to narrow that statement as we grew concerned about chemical weapons, particularly in Libya, but generally as well. The Clinton administration did not explicitly threaten to use nuclear weapons for in response to chemical weapons use, but it did make it clear it would not take the option off the table, and this is kind of where that phrase "off the table" comes from. Secretary of Defense William Perry stated, and again I quote, "If some nation were to attack the United States with chemical weapons, then they would have to fear the consequences of a response from any weapon in our inventory. We could make a devastating response without the use of nuclear weapons, but we would not forswear that possibility." That is clearly more explicit than what we had leading up to this. Assistant Secretary of Defense Ted Warner testified to Congress on something similar, and again, this is all in the Libya context, but it does broaden out. What Ted Warner said is, "The very existence of U.S. strategic and theater nuclear forces, backed by highly capable conventional forces, should certainly give pause to any rogue leader contemplating the use of WMD against the United States, its overseas deployed forces, or its allies." This is a deterrent threat. This is a narrowing of our negative security assurances. The words matter. Now, the Bush administration, setting aside the John Bolton hiccup, appeared to shift to a somewhat more explicit approach when acknowledging that the United States might use nuclear weapons in response to attacks by nations armed with chemical, biological, and conventional weapons, even if they weren't a nuclear-armed state. It stated that the United States would develop and deploy nuclear capabilities. They would need to defeat the capabilities of any state, not just specifying nuclear-armed states. And President Bush also endorsed a policy of more explicit nuclear threats during a press conference in March of 2002. Again, I quote, he stated that "we want to make it very clear to nations that you will not threaten the United States or use weapons of mass destruction against us or our allies. I view our nuclear arsenal as a deterrent, as a way to say to people that would harm America that there is a consequence. and the president must have all options available to make that deterrent have meaning. That may not sound extreme today, but when he said that, when he explicitly said, we could use nuclear weapons against you, even if you don't have them and you hadn't used them, it raised eyebrows. It raised concerns at the time. Today that sounds almost normal. Actually, today that sounds sane. I have a bunch of other quotes that I won't use, but today that sounds sane. At the time, it was extreme. The Obama administration, however, walked that back in the 2010 NPR. It sought to reduce the roles for U.S. nuclear weapons by indicating that the United States would rely on conventional capabilities and missile defenses to deter and respond to attacks with conventional and chemical weapons, even biological weapons, with a caveat. So it modified the U.S. negative security assurance by declaring, and I quote, "The United States will not use or threaten to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states that are party to the NPT and in compliance with their non-proliferation obligations." Full stop. No exceptions for conventional and chemical weapons. Now again, this is not for states with nuclear weapons. States with nuclear weapons could have a U.S. nuclear response even before they use their nuclear weapons. For states without nuclear weapons, full stop, no nuclear threat, with a caveat. Given the catastrophic potential of biological weapons and the rapid pace of biotechnology development, the United States reserves the right to make any adjustment in that assurance that may be warranted by the evolution and proliferation of biological weapons threat. So again, generally speaking, no nuclear use, maybe an adjustment for bio in the future. Jeff tells me I have 2 minutes, so let me tell you how the 2010 NPR changed this. And there have been debates all over Washington about whether or not the 2018 NPR changed our declaratory policy. If you read the words, there's 3 paragraphs in the NPR that do the declaratory policy. 2 of the paragraphs don't change the words. The 3rd one not only changes the words, but changes the whole meaning. I am not alone in viewing it this way, but I know I am in contrast to everyone inside the administration. So, the 2000 NPR had 2 paragraphs on the negative security assurance. The first one is exactly the same as the Obama paragraph, with that full stop. We won't use nuclear weapons against you if you are a non-nuclear weapons state in compliance with your non-proliferation obligations. But where the Obama administration had a bio carve-out, the 3rd paragraph says, given the potential of significant non-nuclear strategic attacks, the United States reserves the right to make any adjustment in the assurance that may be warranted by the evolution and proliferation of non-nuclear strategic attack technologies and U.S. capabilities to counter the threat. That paragraph doesn't specify what are non-nuclear strategic attacks, but later in the document it lists non-strategic nuclear attacks to include chemical, biological, cyber, and large-scale conventional aggression. Pardon me for parsing words, but I read that as saying, we won't use nuclear weapons against you if you are in compliance with your non-proliferation obligations, unless sometime in the future you acquire some capability that we won't specify that causes us great concern, and then we might use nuclear weapons against you. I'm sorry. I know the people who wrote the NPR don't see it that way. I had a debate with a general a couple of weeks ago. He just insisted the policy hadn't changed. That's how I see it. It's a personal opinion. Don't attribute it to CRS. To my mind, not only is our declaratory policy now no longer a promise, it is a threat. And it's a threat that may deter other kinds of attacks on the United States, but it also may undermine our non-proliferation policy. So why do I belabor this point? I pointed out that the fundamentals of deterrence include the ability to credibly communicate when we will and won't use nuclear weapons. I don't know if these changes in our declaratory policy are credible. Does a bad guy believe that if they launch a conventional attack on the United States, we might use nuclear weapons against them? As Paul pointed out, escalation may not be linear. But if everything out there that might make us worried could bring about a nuclear threat, then I'd argue our nuclear threats aren't credible. We ought to be either more specific about those things that are severe enough to require a nuclear response, or we ought to worry about being caught up in a commitment trap. and the words matter. Now, I have a list of quotes to prove that words matter. They include phrases like Little Rocket Man and Big Buttons and Fire and Fury, but I'm out of time, so if you want to hear the quotes, you can ask about them later.